I call Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to speak in the first reading of the Coroners Amendment Bill, and I'll move straight to the matter raised by the previous speaker around the mandatory response to Coroners' recommendations. And before I do that, I want to thank the Labour opposition for their intention to support this bill. I think indeed it is an important bill which builds on the 2006 Coroners Bill. So to address the members' question around mandatory response to Coroners' recommendations, and I believe this is something that we will have a pretty good look at in the committee, but my initial response and the government's initial response to that query is that it sounds good on the face of it, and of course heed should be taken of the coroner's recommendations, because after all the coroner is charged with considering all aspects of his or her inquiry. But to make a response mandatory in the first instance will require a significant amount of time and a significant amount of resources, particularly for smaller organisations. And it may be that in a particular instance of an inquest, an organisation may not have a direct interest or need to respond. And so that mandatory requirement might have a bit of a perverse effect in that it ties up a number of smaller organisations in responding to a matter which isn't of direct concern to them necessarily. And one would expect, Mr Speaker, that those organisations and groups and agencies who do have a direct interest in that particular coronial inquest will no doubt be responding anyway, because it's in everybody's interests for them to do so. And the other point I would make around mandatory responses to coroners' recommendations is that perhaps it is more beneficial, and we are moving towards the inclusion, and that is contained in this bill, the inclusion of those relevant individuals and organisations early on in the process of the inquest and the investigation itself. So it's a matter of bringing those interested parties on board in the process, so that when the recommendations are made, then those parties who have a view to make and as either a response are brought inside as part of that report. But having said that, Mr Speaker, the previous speaker, Jacinda Ardern, raises a valid point, and it is one that the Justice and Electoral Select Committee will be considering during its consideration of this bill. The whole purpose of this bill is to make more timely, more efficient coronial decisions in what are, in anybody's terms, very, very difficult situations for grieving families, and that will be at the forefront of the consideration of all members of the Select Committee and all members in this Parliament when we come back to debate it throughout the course of its passage. It is a fact that the average coronial inquest takes around 400 days. Now that's over a year for the grieving family and friends and those involved to have the matter still unresolved for them, both at a personal level, but if it involves perhaps an air accident or some other form of mishap, misadventure, then there may well be consequential legislative changes or regulatory changes that the government may need to look at as a consequence of that death. And expediting an inquest has got to be at the benefit of all New Zealanders You know, those that were involved and have sadly passed away, but also those that may be impacted and affected in the future. And even more disturbingly, perhaps, an inquest which is a little more complicated, involving other agencies, as perhaps the Air Accident Investigation Agency. You know, there may be multi-agencies involved in an inquest. Well, that can take up to 700 days, which is a couple of years. That is too long for a family to wait for closure and resolution. There will be families out there today perhaps taking an interest in this debate, and I know there are people with many, many personal stories who will come and speak to us, and I welcome those people who will come to speak to us. But this matters to them. So for those people who are listening or watching the debate today, this Parliament is determined, and I do hope we enjoy the support of the rest of the House, but we are determined to speed up the process, to make it more relevant to those people with a personal interest, but also to those government agencies and other sectors of New Zealand who will have an interest in the result of inquiries. So, Mr. Speaker, the main provisions of the bill are going to require, one of the main provisions is going to require a coroner's recommendation to require them to be more specific to the actual case that they are considering and the evidence before them as the coroner, and to be clear about how they would reduce the likelihood of future deaths in similar circumstances. So maybe tightening up the criteria around what the coroner is reporting. The bill will give the chief coroner better tools to improve timeliness, and I've already made reference to that, such as, and I think this is a very good provision in the bill, a requirement to monitor the progress of older cases. And I would not like to think that due to perhaps caseload management, there are cases waiting, older cases waiting for resolution, because these are not just cases. These are inquests into the deaths of people, and so we want a sharper focus on providing resolution for those. So I want to acknowledge the input of a number of organisations into the drafting of this bill. The Law Commission, of course, in 2000, and let me just go through my notes, because we met with the Law Commission this morning, and they made a submission to the Justice Committee this morning and made reference to their work on this bill. They made 17 recommendations to the government around coroners' inquests, and the government fully accepts 14 proposals for changing the Coroners Act and generally accepts 3 further recommendations about developing reporting standards around inquests. And so I want to acknowledge the Law Commission for their work in this, but also other organisations. The Funeral Directors Association of New Zealand, which is a relatively small association and has a new chief executive who was mentioned also by the former speaker, a former MP, Katrina Shanks. And Katrina Shanks, as their new chief executive, has made an absolute focus on the care of families at the time of death, but in particular in this instance, the care of families in times of sudden death, unexplained death or suicide. Mr. Speaker, in the couple of moments I have left, I just want to talk about suicide and the suicide of young people, and just to talk about a meeting I attended in Alexandra, and there was another one in Kura and another one in Oamaru. I'm describing my electorate, but this happens all throughout New Zealand, where groups of parents and educators are getting together to discuss youth suicide. And in those meetings that I attended late last year, Mike King came along and spoke of his experience of depression and the prevention of youth suicide. In each of those meetings, the town halls were absolutely full of concerned parents and concerned children. Youth suicide and suicide reporting is a critical part of this bill. There will be new regulation around suicide reporting. We do not want copycat suicides through misreporting to continue in New Zealand. It is a concern that has been raised in many quarters. I look forward to examination of this bill. I look forward to working collegially with members across the House and on to the second reading in committee stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.